So go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So this is me. Okay. O katira tēnā tātou. Tēnā tātou kua hui mai nei I raro I te kaupapa o ngā reo take o te ao. Ko maunga tukorangi toku maunga, ko Waitiki toku awa, ko Ngāti Kurui toku iwi, ko Pohotiari toku hapu, ko Te Hāpua toku marae, ko Sophie Nock ahau. So greetings and salutations, everyone. I can't see everybody's faces, but what an honour for me to be here presenting a paper that I have already published, but on a topic that is very dear to my heart. So part of our Māori culture is we always introduce ourselves into it, well, not necessarily into Reo Māori, but what I just described was I talked about my sacred mountain, I talked about my river, I talked about my tribal affiliations, my sub-tribal affiliations, and I talked about my marae. So the marae in the Māori world is a place where Māori can gather and partake in their rituals, Māori rituals, and basically be in their own world. So greetings from New Zealand, and to each and every one of you from wherever you are in the world. When we also have a tradition in Māori that when we introduce ourselves, we normally follow with a song, but this song is actually a proverb. So I wanted to share this proverb with each and every one of you. So I'll read the Māori, Hutia te rito, pull out the centre of the flax, Hutia te rito te harakeke, where is the bellbird? Kei he te komako e ko, where is the bellbird, dear friend? Ki mai kia hau, you ask me, how ha te mea nui o te ao? What are the important things of the world? Māku e ki atu, I reply forcefully, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata, he. It is people, it is people, it is people. So ladies and gentlemen, with that proverb, I will now just quickly give you an overview of my talk today, well, tonight for me. So I'll quickly give an introduction and a bit of a background on Te Reo Māori, the analysis and major developments in second language teaching, talk a little bit about focus points that I use for my analysis, and then I'll give you an overview and an analysis of findings for teaching Te Reo Māori and teaching the Hawaiian language. Then quickly discuss the lessons learnt, and then so from all of that research, what are the things that could be done better? So designing more effective textbooks for Indigenous and endangered languages. Concluding, and then I'll have some concluding thoughts and time for a change. So just quickly, a little bit about New Zealand. So our total, look at that population, which we're bordering on that 5 million mark. And when we talk about Māori, Māori make up approximately 16% of that 5 million. As far as speakers of the Māori language goes, we really don't have any like up-to-date or really accurate numbers for the number of Māori speakers. Whenever we do the census, the question is, can you speak Māori? And then they have these varying levels, you know, are you a beginner, are you a intermediate, are you advanced, are you native, etc. So whenever you have a self-reporting system like that, it's very hard to get a really accurate number. But in any case, Te Reo Māori is the Māori language, is the ancestral tongue of the Māori people of New Zealand. And prior to the arrival of Europeans, a great body of, so our language was really a language that was transmitted orally. And most of this language, like a great body of myth, legend, historical tradition, was passed down the generations in prose narrative, sung poetry, and genealogical recital. And these were the three literary media of pre-European Māori society. So in other words, we didn't really have a pen and paper per se. So our language wasn't written down in the form that we recognize now, but it was captured in our carvings. So a lot of our history is in our carvings that we have on our marae, on our ancestral houses. And within those houses, there are also what we call tukutuku, which are like our panel designs. So as well as these, the prose narratives, sung poetry, and genealogical recitals, in our view, our language, we did have our means of maintaining and preserving the language. From 1800 onwards, European and American whalers began to arrive in New Zealand. The first schools were missionary schools. So if you can imagine pre-European arrival times, our children didn't actually go to school, but they lived in a society where, you know, in clusters or in clans of about up to 30 people. And the educators were the grandparents. So the parents were the hunters and gatherers, and the grandparents were the teachers. So that's where that form of teaching happened prior to being forced to go to schools. So in 1847, there was this Education Ordinance Act that came about, and basically what that act said was we have to stop teaching Māori language in the schools, or even teaching through Māori language. And subsequently, these following acts, Native Schools Acts, actually forbade the teaching of Te Reo Māori in the schools. So in 1900, over 90% of Māori children spoke Te Reo Māori when they entered the school. By 1960, that had dropped to 26%. In 1984, 2%. So 2% of our children that were attending school could speak Te Reo Māori. So you can imagine between the 1900s and the 1984s, and of course a lot of things have happened. There was urbanization, et cetera, So, but I think one of the fundamental things that happened between the 1900s and the 1984s was that Te Reo Māori was not spoken in the homes. And we know that the most dominant domain for a language to survive is in the home. All right, so language revitalization efforts have played a primary role in many communities, and least of all in the educational arena. But back in the 1980s, or actually in the 1970s, there was some research conducted, and the findings from that research basically said to Māoridom, if you do not do something about your language, within 30 years, your language will be gone. So in the 1980s, some well-known and respected Māori elders got together and said, we can't let that happen to our language. We need to be proactive. We need to do something. So in the 1980s, the Te Kohanga Reo movement happened, and this was our preschool language nest. But not only was it an initiative to save the language, it was also a political statement to the government, to the Crown, that said, we are no longer going to sit back and let things happen to us. We are going to do something about revitalizing our language, and hence began the Kohanga Reo movement. From the Kohanga Reo movement came the Kura Kaupapa Māori, or the Māori immersion programs. because the children were coming through with the language, and then when they got to schools, there were no schools that could cater for them in their language. So again, another group of well-known Māori elders got together and said, look, we need to have something to continue the language. So the Māori Immersion Primary School started, and of course from there, the momentum kept going, and then they had the secondary schools, and then we've got the Māori universities. So that's pretty much a quick overview of Te Reo Māori. And now let's get into the purpose of my presentation, which is to talk about the teaching and learning of second languages, but in particular textbooks. So just a little bit of background of my presentation. In my PhD, my topic was to look at how Te Reo Māori is taught in English medium schools. And so I looked at, I did some teaching observations. I did a questionnaire with teachers. I looked at the resources, internet resources, all different types of resources that our teachers use. And then I looked at textbooks. So the textbooks I looked at came from the teachers themselves. So in teaching learning of second additional language, textbooks are used very widely. So some of the dangers of using textbooks, the fact that they may actually take the place of the curriculum. And for Te Reo Māori and the Hawaiian language, this is actually the case, because we haven't, prior to 2007, we really didn't have a curriculum document for Te Reo Māori. And same with the Hawaiian language. So, you know, and some of the other comments where maybe the textbooks are inflexible. They can also make false claims and have serious design flaws, practical shortcomings. But in general, they lack authenticity and fail to provide adequate coverage of the language. And I mean, that would certainly be the case if you don't have a curriculum, because you need the curriculum to help guide you with what the content should be. However, some of the potential advantages, they can reduce a teacher's workload, provide ideas about what to teach and how to teach, and that would absolutely be true if you don't have a curriculum to follow. Assist with innovation and support teachers through periods of change. And I mean, you could not argue with that. Teachers are already overworked and overloaded. So having a textbook for them to refer to would definitely lighten their workload. So as I mentioned, I did critique 3 books that I will talk about shortly. But before I do that, I think it's appropriate that I recognize and acknowledge the authors of these books. So whilst it's recognized that the time for change in the design of textbooks for Indigenous or endangered languages is well overdue, it is important to acknowledge that the authors of textbooks such as the ones examined here have indeed made a significant contribution. So they have helped, you know, our teachers, particularly when there's no curriculum available. All right, so the analysis that I looked at, well, how I analyzed the books were, in what way did the textbooks incorporate the research based as they relate to teaching resources, and the recommendations relating to the teaching approaches made in the relevant curriculum document. So these were the 2 main areas that I looked at. Have they incorporated any of the new developments in teaching additional or second languages? And do they actually replicate or do they complement the curriculum document? So some of the new or major developments in second language, so new approaches to the concept of culture, the emerging development of concepts of communicative competence, communicative language teaching, new approaches to language proficiency, testing and assessments. So these are some of the major developments that have happened. So my task was to find out whether or not the textbooks that I looked at actually incorporated any of this. So the focus points for the analysis, each textbook is analysed in terms of focus points, and these were developed by Wang and Naismith. And these two were two PhD students out of the University of Waikato, and based on literature on textbooks, evaluations, and adapted from Coleman and Cunningsworth. So the focus points that they used, and I used as well, so language content, so including text types, genres, and language schools. So basically the language content, how was the language content determined? Did it follow some pedagogic formula, or was it just all randomly chosen? And same with the tasks and activities. Were they complementary? Were they communicative? Or were they really just a whole lot of translations? The quality and relevance of illustrations. So I looked at the illustrations, and one of the important things about illustrations, that it's actually helpful if the illustrations can actually convey the meaning sometimes, rather than it just being a picture for a picture's sake. Approach and methodology. So did the textbooks actually help with the teaching? So did it have, you know, like lessons or how to teach the particular content? Cultural content. So was the cultural content integrated into the teaching, or was it taught separately? Interest level. So how interesting was the whole textbook? You know, the content, the pictures, everything. Was it interesting to look at? And the quality and quantity of supplementary resources. So one thing that I've noticed about supplementary resources are these other things that will help us as teachers and giving us explanations on how to use the textbook, how to approach the tasks, how to approach the methodology. So the supplementary resources are really, really important. Let's go. So the three books that I looked at for teaching Te Reo Māori: Te Rangatahi, or the New Net; Te Mātāpuna, the Source; Te Kākono, the Seed. So Te Kākono, I'm just moving that over slightly, yeah. So overall, Te Rangatahi, which was back in the 1970s, largely characterized by an approach similar in most respects to grammar translation, but without its emphasis on grammatical rules, supplemented in terms of some of the exercises included by that repetition with variation that is associated with audiolingual habit theory. So basically, everything was translated into English. So it was written in Māori, everything was translated into English. So you may as well have been teaching Te Reo Māori through English. The next book that I looked at was Te Kākono, which is probably the most popular textbook as far as teaching Te Reo Māori goes. So this textbook includes a considerable amount of culturally relevant material and some activities that are communicatively oriented. Overall, however, it appears to hark back largely to the type of approach exhibited in Te Rangatahi. That is, it introduces a lot of new language simultaneously. So there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason for why the language is introduced as it is. It includes long lists of vocabulary, and I'm sure that there's some research out there somewhere that says when you're learning a language, probably the maximum that you could probably retain in any one session would be between 7 and 15. So if you go over that, the students aren't going to retain. And the other thing, it relies heavily on translation, as with the first book, and exercises that involve the manipulation of decontextualized language forms. And that was an interesting thing with this book, was there were lots of constructions, but they weren't joined in any way. They were like just separate sentences. And includes many grammatical focused explanations, but again, everything is in English. But having said that, some teachers actually like that kind of explanation because it helps them, particularly if they're not a fluent speaker in the language or not linguistically inclined. So that kind of explanation is quite helpful for them. Then the third book that I looked at, Te Mata Puna. So this textbook introduces a considerable amount of new language simultaneously. So that seems to be the pattern with these books. It's just like, let's get as much content as we can into a small space, and then and let people kind of flounder their way through it. The new language introduced appears to be selected largely on the basis of topic relevance, with little account being taken of grading in any sense. So I know I keep going back to this, but there just doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason why and how the language is presented in these textbooks. Most of the exercises are very traditional and tight, involving comprehension questions or the manipulation of decontextualized vocabulary and grammatical constructions. Although there are a few examples of pair work, student interaction is limited. There are no genuinely communicative oriented activities. So something like doing pair work or even a group activity, and it could be doing things like doing surveys, getting the children to interact with each other, doing surveys or filling in the gaps. There's none of that. A lot of it is just translate this, yeah, pretty much translation. There is little culturally specific content. The fact that there is a total absence of translation in the textbook is also misleading. So this particular textbook is totally written in Te Reo Māori. And this textbook is given to the students, and even if they're an absolute beginner, everything is written in Te Reo Māori. So really it's almost, well, for some of them, it could be a foreign language. So it hasn't, even though it's all in Te Reo Māori, the language hasn't been graded correctly. And by that I mean, you know, if you're an absolute beginner, there's only a certain amount of language that you will understand before you can go to the next level. So for the 3 Hawaiian books that I've got here, honestly, it's pretty much the same kind of scenario. So you've got Kale Ha'ahoel, the Proud Garland, Ngā Kai E Walu, the 8 C's or channels, and Olelo o Iwa, say native language. And so in the first book, it focuses on sets of grammatical patterns, contains explanations in English, dialogue snippets, Hawaiian vocabulary lists with English translations. Exercises consist of translations, substitutions, reading practice passages, Hawaiian idioms and phrases with translations. The second book, Ngā Kai E Waru, focuses on grammatical patterns, explanations in English, dialogue snippets, Hawaiian vocabulary with English translation, exercises, translation, substitution, reading practice, multiple choice, question and answer, spelling, Hawaiian idioms. And the last book has formulaic greetings and short phrases, explanation about Hawaiian pronunciation, structured role-playing exercise, very good. Explanation about numbers, telling time, days of the week, grammatical patterns, Hawaiian vocabulary, exercises, substitution, role-playing, scrambled sentences, question. The interesting thing about this particular book, there's not one picture. There are no pictures in this particular book. So the findings for Māori in the Hawaiian textbooks. So when you look at the 6 books together, they're a combination of audiolingual methodology, grammar translation. Heavy reliance on a combination of translation and grammatical explanations. Emphasis on imitation, repetition, and the construction of and reconstruction of individual, generally decontextualized sentences. Translation plays a fundamental role in many of the exercises in relation to concept introduction. There's almost total absence of genuinely interactive communicative activities. And dialogues and dialogue snippets are extremely artificial with no audio or video recordings. And there's no opportunity for revision or extension. And what I mean by that is that in the textbook, so if you go from one chapter to the next chapter there should be some kind of revision of the previous chapter. And if you want to do extension, then it needs to be done gradually and not forcefully. It's nice to challenge the students, but not to overwhelm them. And a lot of the content, the language content that are included in these books it's just overwhelming for the students, unless there's some kind of, like you pre-teach the vocabulary or you pre-teach the constructions. So no illustration to help uncover the meaning of the newly presented language. And I mean, that's important. It's important to have illustrations that can help the student try and decipher perhaps what are the meaning of the words. There's a lack of variety of genres, text types, reading and writing, and lack of supplementary resources such as audio-visual, cue cards, posters, charts, internet assignments, activities, computer games. So a lot of the textbooks, they don't have all of these supplementary and complementary texts, or well, resources, I should say. So what are the lessons to be learnt here? So little, if any, consideration has been given to pedagogic considerations. So as I mentioned before, there's no rhyme or reason why the language or the content is presented in the way that it has been presented. So really careful selection and grading and presentation of content is really important. How much language and what type learners are likely to be able to cope with. So that's that challenging but not overwhelming them. How the meaning of the language can be conveyed and checked without recourse to translation. The problem with translation is that, first of all, you're taking them out of the target language, and that also means that their thinking is being transferred to another language. So pictures, just having pictures to teach words is much better than just giving them the English translation. And there's a lack of textual authenticity, and there's no lesson shaping. And I know for myself as a teacher, if I can have help with how to shape the lessons, that would make my life a lot easier. So let's get into the main part of my kōrero. And you know what? I'm almost to the end. So I might just slow down a bit instead of rushing. But designing more effective textbooks for Indigenous and endangered languages. So perhaps dividing chapters into smaller units rather than, and that will help with the delivery of the content of the language. If you have, if you're hell bent on just putting so much into a chapter, then it just makes the learning a lot more difficult. So if you have smaller units with really, really well thought out and well graded language, with how to deliver that would be really, really helpful for our teachers. So introduce unfamiliar language more gradually. So that kind of ties in with having the smaller units. Rather than trying to group it all together in one fell swoop, break it down into smaller chunks, and it makes it a lot more easier for the students to be able to cope with new and unfamiliar language. Perhaps a comic style text format in which each segment of text is accompanied by a picture. And I've already mentioned how important the pictures are to help to convey the meaning. Another good thing is to pre-teach the vocabulary. Some textbooks, will go to the extent of actually putting the vocabulary at the beginning. And so if teachers are going to follow the pattern of the textbook, then they'll see the vocabulary first, and then they'll teach the vocabulary, so that by the time the students come to read the text, they'll have a better understanding and it's not as overwhelming as it could be. So introduce new structures more gradually, and that just ties in with the earlier comments. Carefully integrate new and familiar language to encourage inferencing. So absolutely, you don't want to hand everything to the students on a platter. Give them an opportunity to think about what could be the meaning here? What are we trying to decipher? Give them an opportunity to challenge themselves as well. Also differentiate between the type of text that is appropriate when new language is being introduced and the type which is appropriate during the practice stage of lessons. There's no point in giving really complex constructions to students that is well over their heads. It's just too overwhelming for them. So all texts need to be accessible and appropriate to the level of the learners. And basically that means it just makes sense if they have an understanding before they actually are given the text to read. So that might be breaking down some of the constructions that are used in the text. It might be teaching them or pre-teaching the vocabulary to help them. Texts also need to serve as genuine meanings, revealing functions. Sentences need to be linked thematically, and illustrations need to be included to help convey meaning. And this is a really nice one. Guidance on how teachers should make use of the dialogues and the monologues. Any kind of assistance for our teachers is a benefit. Tasks and activities need to take into account the different learning styles and proficiency levels. And that's important. So if students are in the higher level, then yes, you need to challenge them more. But if students are in the early stages, the beginning stages, it's better to grade the language so that it's not overwhelming for them. Activities need to be genuinely communicative, including peer and group work, and being focused on conveying real information for genuine purposes. So textbooks should be consistent with the relevant curriculum guidelines document. That really hasn't been the case here in New Zealand as well as Hawaii. Our curriculum for Te Reo Māori in secondary schools was only made available in 2007. And the books that I analyze are well before then. So we actually don't have a textbook that actually is consistent with the relevant curriculum guidelines document. Yes. All right. Okay, and I think the last slide for this designing more effective textbooks is include culturally relevant material. Interesting photographs. So you might be able to see the picture behind the words, and they're all black and white. There's no color in them. And the pictures are really, they're static. There's no, they're not dynamic. So those are the things that we need to consider when we're designing our more effective textbooks. Include reading and writing skills strategies. That's something that was missing in all of the textbooks that were analysed. There was nothing in there to teach them how to scan, you know, how to read something quickly and then have a question for them and then get them to go back and read again. There weren't any kind of strategies to help the teachers. All right, so time for a change. So while many textbooks designed for the teaching and learning of other languages have changed and developed in line with a whole range of exciting research-based innovations, these textbooks continue to reflect a methodology that was common in the mid-1900s, audiolinguism, and an approach that had its heyday in the 18th century, grammar translation. So basically the books that were analysed did not show any of the major developments that have happened over the last 30, 40 years. So my concluding comment, everybody, is Te Reo Māori has been an official language of Aotearoa since 1987. It has been recognised as a treasure which is subject to protection under the terms of the Treaty of Waitangi. So the Treaty of Waitangi was signed back in 1840, which is a treaty between Māori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, and the Crown. However, more than 2/3 of Māori school children attend schools in which the primary language of instruction is English. So despite the Māori initiatives back in the 1980s of having the language nest, the kohanga reo, having the immersion primary schools, having the immersion secondary schools, still more than 2/3 of Māori children attend English medium schools. But however, to do little or nothing would represent a violation of the birthright and heritage of these children. So, e homa, ka te akira, koe rā aku kōrero I tēnei wā, ka nui ngā mihi kia koutou, ka nui ngā mihi kia koutou ngā wahine I tono mai kia hau, kia whāriki hia taku kōrero, nō reira, nei rā taku mihi kia koutou katoa. So just in closing, everyone, I wanted to thank the committee for the invitation to come in and present my my topic this morning. Thank you very much for the invitation, and
thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Sophie. So I'm going to stop the recording now.